So let's begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, so tonight we are going to be looking at chapter 9 and the Paul's apostolic defense is what I've titled it, and that timeline never changes. So we don't. But now tonight we will be just passing through where it talks about. We do a quote from the Old Testament, and we'll see. Going ahead with this lesson tonight, kind of a precursor. The absence of like last week, it started out, the class or the scripture started out with saying, now concerning, which meant that Paul was talking about something that the Corinthians had already talked to him about and written to him in a letter. So he was just going down his checkoff list of the things that he wanted to talk to them about. So in this particular case tonight, it doesn't have that key phrase of now concerning. So that's kind of a clue that this chapter does not deal with a new subject. It's just a continuation and a discussion of it was the discussion of like eating in idol temples, that Paul had talked about before in chapter 8. And he was talking about, again, subjecting our freedom for the welfare of other people is not something that any of us does naturally. We don't like to give up our own freedoms so that we don't offend someone else. And Paul knew that his readers, the Corinthians, would profit from more instruction on this particular subject. And he used himself then as an illustration of the proper attitude toward one's freedom and responsibility in Messiah. So evidently the congregation in Corinth had misunderstood Paul's policy of limiting the exercise of his activities to help others, that he said, in 1 Corinthians 8:13. Some of the congregation had apparently concluded that because he did not exercise his rights, he didn't have them. If he didn't exercise those rights, then he had no rights. And so that now this is what he's going to have to try to fix their misunderstanding of what he was trying to say about his rights, and his apparently vacillating conduct also raised some questions in their minds about his full apostolic authority. For example, he ate marketplace food with Gentiles, but not with Jews. And Paul responded to this viewpoint also in this chapter. And there has been some evidence of the Corinthians' unwillingness to yield to Paul's authority throughout this letter. That's you'll see that over and over again, where Paul is having to try to rein these people in and tell them, look, I'm the authority here. You are not the authority. I'm the one that founded you guys, and so I'm the one that should be telling, making up the rules here. And so this was then, starting with chapter 9, an appropriate place for him to kind of confront that issue. So let's look at that. He says, am I not free? Now he starts out, well, let's read it. Am I not free? Am I not an emissary? Have I not seen Yeshua our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I am not an emissary, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my office of emissary in the Lord. All right, so Paul's he throws out these 4 rhetorical questions, and of course each one of them you expect a each one of them demands really a yes answer. Every one of them, that has to say yes on each one of these questions. Am I not free? Sure he is. Is he an emissary? Yes, he is. Has he seen Yeshua? Yes, he has. And is the congregation there in Corinth his work? He started them. He founded that work, and of course, yes, that is the answer there. So they all had to have a positive answer, and then they became, each question became more and more, increasingly specific. Certainly, he enjoyed the liberty that every other believer had, and he also then, furthermore, he possessed the rights and privileges of an apostle. The proof of his apostleship was twofold. He had seen Messiah. He had seen Yeshua on the Damascus Road in a very, very clear vision, and he had also founded the congregation in Corinth, which, by just its very fact that he founded it, that was an apostolic work. And so clearly Paul's apostleship was at stake here in Corinth, and we read it all in chapter 1 and chapter 4 and chapter 5. So, and then he talks about the others, that he's saying that others may think that I'm not an apostle, and so those others could very well have been certain itinerant preachers and so forth that had come through and had tried to disparage Paul and his ministry to the Corinthians, saying that, here he's gone, he's off doing other things, so he's really not an apostle. If he had been, he would have stayed right here with you. And but Paul tells them, look, just the very existence of you guys here proves that I am an apostle. And so he goes on. Let's go ahead with this. In verse 3, it says, my defense to those who examine me in this examine me is this: don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other emissaries and the Lord's brothers and Kepha? That's Peter. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to not work? Now, there's some double negatives in there, and it gets a little bit confusing, but what Paul is saying here, he has kind of a funny defense in this way, because you would think that, okay, he's making some kind of a defense, but then he kind of sidesteps it and starts talking about his right to compensation or support for being a minister, for being an apostle, for doing his evangelical work. And so, he goes back and talks about, don't we have the right to food and drink? And so it's a little bit strange, his defense. And so here he is talking about his right to financial support. Now, how does that fit in with him being an apostle? Well, he points out that, evidently the other apostles took their wives with them on their missionary journeys. Now, some of the guys went, didn't go very far. Other guys, like, Thomas, went all the way to India. And so possibly he took his wife with him. And we know Peter had a wife, and he took his wife with him where he went. He spent a lot of time in Antioch, and so that's where he ended up. And so so he's pointing this out. So he says, if those guys can take their wives, if those guys get that kind of support for their wives, then how come it's only me and Barnabas that you're telling us that, you guys have a job. You can, you don't, you need to work. You don't have any right to compensation for your ministry, because you have a skill, you have a profession that you can do. And the Bible says that they were tent makers. And kind of a rabbi trail here is that some folks said, well, that tent making was a euphemism for they made talits, okay? Except no, talits were a cultural invention a couple of 300 years later for the Jewish men. They did not wear talits during this time. They wore the tzitzit on the corners of their regular clothing. So they didn't have what we would call a prayer shawl today. They just used their regular clothing if they were, put it over their head or whatever. So it says that they were tent makers. So they were tent makers. And all right, I'll get off of that rabbi trail and off of that little soapbox. All right, so he's asking them, is it just me and Barnabas that you have no right to say, hey, we deserve to be supported in our ministry? But remember now that Paul and Barnabas, they had worked as tent makers in Corinth the whole 18 months or 2 years or something that he was in Corinth. And because of that, I guess the Corinthians decided that, okay, well, you got a job. Why should we support you? Because you're working. It would, and it would be similar in today's world if a pastor or a minister, rabbi, whatever, started a congregation and, founded it, started it, or came in to one that was already existing, and the people said, well, wait a minute, you have a trade, you're a carpenter, or you're a auto mechanic or something like that. You could work at that, and so we don't have to support you then. And so you can see that that's not right. That should never be right, that a congregation would do that. I've had years and years ago, when I was getting out of the Coast Guard looking for my first civilian job, I interviewed for a couple of them, and these guys said, well, this is what we can pay you. And I said, wait a minute, the going rate for that particular job is X, whatever it was. And they said, yeah, but you've got your military pension coming in, so we wouldn't have to pay you as much. And I said, nope, that's not how that's going to work at all. You pay me what I'm worth, or I'm going to go someplace else. And they said, well, we can find other military guys that'll go along, or military retirees that'll accept that offer. I said, go for it. And so it was craziness what they were offering. Basically, shoot, I don't even know if what the numbers were, but it was like a third. They were going to cut what they would pay me by a third to a half, because I had a military pension coming in. So, and this is what these people in Corinth are saying. Well, Paul, you're a tent maker, so you can. You really don't need us. And Paul, in their defense, Paul had worked as a tent maker. He hadn't demanded or asked for compensation from them, but we'll get into that just a little bit later on. Okay. So let's go ahead then. Verse 7. What soldier ever serves at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink its milk? And I don't say these things as merely as a man, do I? Doesn't Torah also say these things? For it is written in the Torah of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is threshing. Is it the ox that concern God? Or is he speaking entirely for our sake? Yes, it was written for our sake, because the one plowing ought to plow in hope, and the one threshing in hope of a share in the crop. All right. So what we see here is with Paul, he gives some examples of different kind of service or job occupation that obviously all of them end up in some kind of a support. A soldier gets pay from the government to that he is defending or that's hiring him to do his soldiering. He doesn't do it just for the fun of it. And so it's like and the guy that has the vineyard, well, he's not going to plant trees and then not eat the fruit. That doesn't make any sense. It's just crazy. And same with the guy that he's a shepherd. Well, he's going to have sheep or goat's milk and cheese and that sort of thing. And so Paul is saying, listen, am I asking this just as a man, or am I making up these rules? And he said, no, because Torah says that you should not muzzle an ox while it is threshing. That's what they would do. They would put the grain, and the grains that they had in those days, they were not particularly like what we had today. They had hard husks on them, and they would walk an ox around it, and there would be a kind of a sled, a heavy wooden sled behind it too, that he would walk around in this circle with this grain on this great big threshing field, and he'd walk around and around in circles in this, in a yoke, pulling this heavy sled, and that sled then would kind of smash and roll the wheat and break the husk away from the kernel, and then of course they would take the stuff and throw it up in the air. It's called winnowing, and the wind would blow and blow the husks away, and then you'd be left with the kernel of grain. So and the Bible says, okay, you should not muzzle an ox. And in other words, if the ox reaches down there and takes a bite of some of the grain, well, let him take a bite of some of the grain, because that's his due. He's working for this stuff. And so and Paul asked the question, he says, so did God say that just because he likes oxen, or was he was concerned about the oxen? Well, he's basically, it was that it's a Jewish kind of a thing in their teaching and in their way of looking at the Bible. This is from the lesser to the greater. Well, if God cared for that oxen, just an old dumb beast, so much the more he's going to care about his crowning creation, which was man. So Paul is saying here that if God cares for that oxen, he's certainly going to care for the man. And he said, yes, this was written for our sake, because no matter what a person is called to do in the ministry or in a job, in a vocation, he should have the right to, he should expect, he should hope that, okay, I am going to be compensated for this. So the guy that plows, even though all he's doing is just plowing, and maybe somebody else comes in and plants the seed, and then someone else comes in there and threshes it, or harvests it, and then finally somebody else comes in and threshes, all of those different functions to get the grain from the farm to the table. Every person involved in that should have the expectation of support or compensation. And so that's what Paul is saying here, that no matter what you're doing for the kingdom, you expect that whether a guy is a in the congregation, if he's the pastor, rabbi, whatever, he expects that he should be compensated, and it kind of goes up from there. I know growing up, there were certain functions that when and I always went to little churches instead of when I was small, and not until I got really much older did I ever attend a large, a mega church. You know, we always were out in the country, and we went to these little bitty churches that barely kept the pastor alive with the tithes, because they were just working people that didn't have a lot of money. And so those of us then that say played the piano or provided the music or whatever, well, we did that for free, and that in itself was its own compensation. I just thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to be able to do that. I loved doing it, and I still like it today. And so, but then as we got into bigger and bigger organizations, you would find that, okay, you've got a music guy that gets up there and he leads the singing and he leads the choirs and he does all of this. Well, guess what? He gets compensated. He gets paid because that becomes his only occupation, his full-time occupation. Whereas for us growing up, we were just kids or young people, and we played for the fun of it. We just we like to get together. We like to make music. But that for us was just a ministry. It was not something that we did to feed families, because we didn't have families back then. And I didn't have a family at the age of 10 that I was feeding. So, so you get what I'm saying. And that's what Paul is saying, that everybody that participates in the product should have anticipation of getting something from the product. So, let's go ahead. So if we sowed spiritual things to you, is it too much that we reap material things from you? If others have a share in this claim over you, shouldn't we even more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we put up with all things so that we cause no hindrance to the good news of Messiah. Don't you know that those who perform the holy services eat from the temple? Those who wait on the altar receive a share at the altar. So also the Lord ordered those who proclaim the good news to get their living from the good news. Okay, now with that, we got, it's pretty easy to understand here. Paul is just saying, look, we have done ministerial things for you. We started this congregation. We provided the spiritual things that you needed and that you wanted. So is it too much that you can't compensate us? And if others have had a share, that have come along and you've supported them, shouldn't we even more so, because we started this congregation? So, but then he says, but, never mind with that. We didn't use that right. We never asked you for that. We didn't demand that we had compensation from you. And we did all of that so that there would be no hindrance to the good news. And so then he falls back to the example of the temple in Jerusalem, where all of the Levites and the priests, they are supported in part by the offerings that come in to the temple. Almost all of the offerings, except say the burnt offering, which was totally burned up, but most of the other ones, they would burn up a portion of the sacrifice, but then the rest of it went to the priest for their support. Same with a lot of the offerings were required to bring along a drink offering, a wine offering, along with a bread offering or a flour offering. And so they would bring in, so many 10 ephahs of flour or something like that. So, they'd bring in 10 liters or something like 10 2-liter deals of flour for their offering. Sometimes they were supposed to bring in bread that's already been baked and put oil on it and all that. And it just depended on what the offering was, but it was not totally burned up. Only a small portion of it was burned, and then the rest of it went to the priest. So Paul is bringing this out so that they would that as an example of what should be done. So then he says in 14, verse 14, now, so the Lord ordered those who proclaim the good news to get their living from the good news. Now, there's a problem with that. Where does it say that anywhere that that Yeshua? I don't remember him saying that okay, yeah, you guys that are preaching the good news, then you should expect to be paid at least minimum wage from from what you're doing, and the bigger your congregation, the more money that you should be making, and the bigger car you should be driving. I don't see it anywhere in there, and not even to the point where he says that the gospel, the ministry should they should make their living from that. It's not there's no direct quote. Now, can anybody come up with something? What's your idea on why we would think this? Why would Paul say that the Lord had ordered those that proclaim the good news to get their living from the good news? Any ideas on that? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
I think you already brought up a big piece of it, because the whole operation of the tabernacle and later the temple, the IRS was located in the temple. So you had to support the whole thing. I mean, the priests and Levites are working on the Sabbath, for example, which would be a violation of the working on the Sabbath laws and so on. So just by the way the whole system was set up, it stands to reason priests and Levites are getting paid, if you will, for their work. That ministers of the good news then would be it's the same concept.
Yeah, it pretty much, in some ways it certainly is. And the idea, though, that they were also violating the commandment not to work on Shabbat. The problem with that, or the thing that is that what they were doing, that was not so much their work as was their avodah. That was their not their vocation, but it was their avocation. It was what they were ordered to do for spiritual things. And so, yeah, Saturday is my roughest, hardest, hardworking day of the entire week. I will tell you that for sure. That's the one that stresses me out more. And, getting ready for it, I don't normally sleep well at all on a Friday night. And so, yeah, I work on Shabbat. That is my job. But I'm not violating the law of not working, because it's a different kind of work. It's something that God commands those in our position to do for the people. So it's our worship, is not so much our work. And go ahead, Karen. You had a comment.
Yeah, Steve, it's Leonard.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that in the New Testament it says that a man, I guess, that preaches is worthy of his wages, whatever that would be. I guess. I mean, I don't know.
Well, he wasn't. Yeshua wasn't particularly talking about the minister, though. He did. I mean, I'm just. Is this a trick question? Maybe not. That where he's talking about the idea of man is worth his wages. That's very true. But at where I'm coming from. Well, before I say that, Carmen has a comment.
Well, that was also probably in Luke 10. It says that same thing. The worker is worthy of his wages. Don't take anything, money bag, all this kind of stuff. But you go to someone's house and you're staying there. So that's kind of like, I'm thinking back then, that's your income. You stay there, they feed you, they house you. And so you have a roof over your head that you would normally, in this day and age, especially, you have to pay for that stuff. So we give tithes for that, for those things to be paid for, right?
Right. Well, and that's where I was going with that, where Yeshua says when he was sending the 12 out first, then he sent the 70 out later. He said, don't bring a purse with you. Don't expect to pay your own way. It should be paid for you. But it was subsistence pay. I mean, this was not something that any of them, if they were getting wealthy off of this, then they were doing something wrong. Okay. And I will say that right now, if a preacher or a pastor or something gets fabulously wealthy from his ministry, then he's doing something wrong. That's not the way that I believe that the Lord wanted these things to be. Living adequately, yes, but a $10 million mansion and private jets and servants and all that kind of stuff. No, I don't think any minister of the gospel has a right to something like that. And so I'll just back off on that before I get in trouble. But
Well,
that was
no, because that should be put back into the community of the poor and the needy people and
absolutely
um,
taking care of folks.
some of that money. Yes.
And
Right.
and I can tell you that at Tree of Life we do a lot of that. We try to take care of people that come to our knowledge that are really struggling. They've lost jobs, lost whatever. In some cases, they've lost their house, their home. We've done those that's what we do. So, we're never going to be a very wealthy congregation. I can tell you that for sure, because we take care of people. And I think that's I think that is the pattern, the model that was set before us. And I think that's where the idea that Paul came up with is that those that proclaim the good news should get their living. They should be able to live adequately on that. And back in those days, if you had a roof over your head and food to eat, well, hey, you were doing pretty good, because there are a lot of people that didn't at all. And so I think that's where it comes. So it's not that Paul was making something up. It's just you kind of have to look at the context of where we were on that. So yeah, good answers. Any other comments or anything? Charlie.
Yeah, I've seen some books of larger churches, and for the most part, they go out in the community and share, like you're talking about, support the community, support the country, and support the world. They send millions and millions of dollars to these larger churches.
Yeah.
And where you see the pastors that you're talking about with these large homes, private jets, whatever, limousines, multi-$1,000 suits.
Yeah.
Typically they come from book sales, video sales, and extracurricular things like that.
It could be. Yeah, I know
They do.
a guy here in town.
I've been in
like
meetings. I've been in meetings with them when that's what they talk about. Okay, and they start out. How were your book sales this year? Which one of your books sold? Which and that's what they talk about.
Yeah.
And they look at, and what if anything, that's what turns me off about those particular people, is they concern themselves a lot with their book sales.
Yeah.
And video sales and so forth. But still, they're excellent pastors. They're reaching people, and their outreach is tremendous.
Yeah,
because their churches are so large.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind that it really does a great job, and I know a little bit more about their particular situation is Gateway up in Dallas with Robert Morris, and that he does he lives okay, but I mean he's not extravagant, but they give so much money to the gospel and they plow back into the word and to bring the gospel out to just millions and millions of people all over the world. They have such an outreach, and especially they started out with saying we are going to give at least 10% each week to Israel, or to the to Jewish concerns, and like orphanages and that sort of stuff, and we try to do that with Tree of Life. We've looked and found some organizations that we feel like are trustworthy, and they feed and clothe and house unfortunate people in Israel. And so God has blessed us with in that regard. And so but that's getting back to where how did the Lord proclaim the good news? Should people that proclaim the good news should get their living from the good news? I think it goes to that point where he sent the 70 out and says, don't take a purse, but just take what what the people will give you for your sustenance, for sustaining you. And I think that's where that comes from. Any other comments or questions? Carl, you're still open.
Shouldn't be.
Okay. All right. Good enough. Well, then let's see if there's nothing else on that. Then let's go on. Paul says, but I have used none of these things, and I'm not writing these things so that it will happen this way in my case. For I would rather die than let anyone deprive me of my reason to boast. For if I proclaim the good news, I have no reason to boast. For pressure is put on me, and woe to me if I don't proclaim the good news. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I have been entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? What that when I preach, I may present the good news free of charge, not making use of my right in the good news. Okay, now this one, it's in some cases this is a little bit tough to understand. Paul never, when he was there in Corinth, he did not ask them for support, and now he's bringing this up. Not, it would seem like he was bringing it up so that they would be shamed into supporting him, and he and Barnabas. But he said, no, I'm not doing that at all. I'm not saying that. I'm not bringing these things up because that I want you in this case to start supporting me. And then he says something curious there. I would rather die than to let anyone deprive me of my reason to boast. And now, that's a little strange to say something like that he is so boastful and prideful that he'd rather die than somebody take away his opportunity to be boastful and prideful. Well, that's not what he's saying at all. Because in his other writings, he would say, well, he says, I don't boast in anything except Yeshua and him on the cross. He says, that's what I boast about. That is what I am prideful about. And that's what I am, my whole life is tied up in that's what I am proud of. So let's look at it this way. He says, I would rather die than to let someone deprive me of my reason to boast, meaning that I would rather die than not being able to go out and preach the gospel. Is basically what he's saying, because his reason to boast was to go out and preach the gospel. And he said, so if I can't go out and preach the gospel, then I would just as soon die and go on, because, he said it in another one of his letters that he said, for me to live is gain, for me to die is Messiah or Christ. And so here, that's how we kind of unlock this one here. He says, I would rather die than not being able to go out there and preach the gospel, because that is what I really boast of, is my relationship with Yeshua, because he saved me and he gave me eternal life. So he says, so if I proclaim the good news, I have no reason to boast. In itself is not just the idea of his proclamation and his preaching. That's not what he was boasting about. He's boasting about Yeshua himself, not on Paul's ministry. And he said, so, but I have pressure on me to do this. He said, that's my calling. That's what I'm supposed to do. And then just shame on me if I don't do it. And so, and if I do it of my own will, he said, that's my reward. And he says, if I don't do it of my own will, I've been entrusted with the commission. In other words, he's a slave to Yeshua, and Yeshua says, this is what you will do. He said, well, guess what? That's the reward too, that he's told me to do this, and I'm telling the world, just because he's my master, I'm his slave, so I'm doing what he tells me to do. And so he says, even with doing that, he's not claiming any kind of rights or privileges, because he is preaching the good news. So that's one of those verses that kind of gets a little bit difficult to understand, but I think that's the gist of it right there. Anybody got a different take on that? Okay. So let's go ahead with verses 19 to 23. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win over more of them. To the Jewish people, I identified as a Jew, so that I might win over the Jewish people. To those under the Torah, I became like one under Torah, though not myself being under Torah, so that I might win over those under Torah. To those outside Torah, like one outside Torah, though not being outside God's Torah, but in Messiah's Torah, so that I might win over those outside Torah. To the weak I became weak, so that I might win over the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all means possible I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the good news, that I might be a fellow partaker in it. Like the fellow in the orchard that planted the orchard, he wants to get a bite of that fruit every once in a while. So when it becomes ripe. So, all right. This is this kind of gets people wound up sometimes on this idea of Paul not being under Torah. And I'll tell you what, reading the commentaries that I have, and I've I guess on this particular book, I've got at least 6 or 8 books just on 1 Corinthians, and then a plethora of just other commentaries that I have access to. And, you read through this thing and says, well, see, this proves that Paul was now a Christian. He was no longer a Jew. And it proves nothing of the sort there. Okay. So Paul was saying, okay, I am free from all men. I'm not tied to any one party. I'm not tied to any one particular denomination of people. And he says, but I have made my slave not to just one man or one party or one group, but a slave to all, so that I could win all of these people over, whatever it takes. He says, to the Jewish people, okay, I can talk to them as a Jew because I am a Jew. I have he'd said in other places, he says, man, I am a Jew's Jew. I'm a Pharisee of Pharisees. And so he's, don't try to out-Jew a Jew like me. You can't do it. And so he would go and he could talk to Jewish people on their level, and whatever level that may be, and he could talk to them about the Lord and bring out scripture to them from the Tanakh about the Messiah and the prophecies and so forth. And so he says that to those under Torah, I became like one under Torah. The commentators said, see, here he was no longer under Torah, because he says that. So he had to bring himself back up underneath it. So that meant that he wasn't under Torah. And even though, and it even says that, though not myself being under Torah, so that I might win over those under Torah. Okay, let's kind of break that down a little bit so that one under Torah, although I'm not under Torah. Okay, remember now, what did Paul say that Torah was? It was a guardian. It was something to guide us to the Messiah. That was the purpose of Torah, was to give us God's standard of holiness and to point to us and say, okay, you cannot meet up to God's standard of holiness and have total 100% righteous standing before the Lord except through Yeshua. So Paul was under that Torah, and he was so now he has accepted the sacrifice of Yeshua. So yeah, he's not in that portion of Torah, or that aspect of Torah where it's drawing him to the Messiah. He's arrived at that point. He has accepted Messiah, and so that part of the Torah, that the function of that part of the Torah to draw him to Messiah, has already been completed. So he's not under that, but he says, I can go back to that and start pointing out to the Jewish people how they need to, how the Torah is pointing them to Messiah. I can go back to that. And so then that's what he's saying. And even though I am now not under that Torah, he says, I've basically, he's kind of graduated, as it were, from the aspect of being drawn to Messiah, because now he has a Messiah. And so he's, let's face it, Paul never did stop doing Jewish things. He still went to the temple. He still offered sacrifices. He still followed the feast. I mean, there was some times where he says, I have to get onto a ship so that I can make it back to Jerusalem in time for the feast. And so he still did all of those kind of things. He went through and with people who were in Nazarite vows, and cutting his hair and taking the mikvahs and paying the offerings and so forth. He kept on doing that, as did all the other disciples. None of them stopped being Jews. Okay, and so I kind of get a little chuckle out of it. People says, well, when Saul became a Christian and changed his name to Paul, okay, Paul never did change his name. Was still Shaul in his Jewish family and context. His name was Paul in his Greco-Roman context. It was a very, very common thing that a lot of people had two names. Their name within their ethnic or their ethnicity, nationality, whatever they were, and then they had another name that they went under for business purposes and for whatever other things that they did. So Paul was still Rav Shaul and the Apostle Paul, one and the same guy. And Paul never did convert away from or out of Judaism. It was just that he became a completed Jew in that he saw the Messiah for who he was. All right. So going on with this, and I have to talk faster, that he says, so, and those outside of Torah, meaning, excuse me, the ones who were not Jewish, they didn't grow up with Torah. He said, I can be like those guys. I can be with them and talk to them outside of Torah. And so it's it says I can do that. I'm educated enough to do all of that. And just hang on just a second. And go ahead. I can do any of those kind of things. He says, I can to the he says, because here's that I'm outside of Torah, but although not being outside God's Torah, but I'm in Messiah's Torah. So he's made that transition from the sacrificial system of the Torah to then the messianic aspect of Torah. Remember, Yeshua said not one jot or tittle of the Torah is going to go away as long as there's a heaven and earth.
Exactly.
And so it's still there, folks. It hasn't gone away. Jesus or Yeshua never did nail the law to the cross so that it no longer existed. The law of Messiah of Christ did not negate or stop the law of Moses. Okay.
Okay.
So
Could I ask this now? This commentary that I have here, which I think is pretty nice, but is it fair to say that, or am I understanding Paul was refusing a compensation?
yeah, at this point,
Okay.
he says,
Okay.
I don't need it. And he says,
Right.
I don't want to become beholden to you.
Right. And so this, a commentary I have, which is really very good and kind of speaks to today, is that because he was his self-imposed slavery, I'm trying to hurry because I know you're concerned about
That's good.
to speak the gospel in a forthright manner, unhindered by cultural hangups.
Yeah.
And so that's what we need more of, that will speak the truth. Not worried about offending other people or getting fired.
Not worrying about whether he's going to offend a deacon and then they vote him out.
And kicked off
Well, I tell you what, I
Facebook
can tell you a story from our past. When I'd come to the end of my obligation within the Coast Guard 5 years after the academy, I was thinking about going into full-time music ministry. And I was in a large church and thinking about, doing what I had to do to become a full-time music minister. And so I already had my my papers with the denomination there. And so I called two friends who were both professional music people. One was an evangelist, traveled all over the place, and he still does today. Even though he's older than dirt, he and his wife are still out there doing it and doing a great job. And then I talked to another guy who was he had his doctorate in music, and he was way on up there in a mega church and so forth. And I asked both of them, what should I do? And both of them said, you should stay in the Coast Guard. God will use you wherever you are, no matter where you are or what you're doing. He'll find a job for you. He'll find something that will be satisfying in ministry for you. Don't get out and become a full-time minister, because once you do that, you are subject to so much pressure to do this or do that or do the, you can't be your own man anymore. And
you can't be God's man. Yeah.
and it was good advice. I went ahead and I stayed in the Coast Guard, went ahead and retired out. But every place that we went, wherever I was transferred to, I mean, just something dropped right into my lap as far as a ministry. Now, it wasn't always music. Like I said yesterday in the sermon, I became a ship captain, and all I did was, what did I do for the gospel? I delivered stuff on my ship. As we had space on my ship, we would put it down in the hold. And when we visited these different places, we could bring things to these missionaries, and not only our own denomination that I was in at the time, but other denominations who were evangelical, who were preaching the gospel or having medical facilities and so forth. We carried an airplane to Mindanao for a German organization that was setting up a hospital in Muslim part of the Philippines. And because they said, we can bring the gospel to these Muslims. And so I was able to help with that. That was, that was tremendous to me. And so God used us in so many ways. And so it's just one of those kind of things where, yeah, you kind of have to be and do whatever it is and be flexible. Don't be afraid to get outside your box. And anyway, I would start preaching here, and then we would be here another hour before I got done. So let's let's go ahead. Did I explain that stuff about being under Torah and not under Torah, and all of that kind of stuff adequately? Because I don't want people to be confused
Yes.
on that, because I think that is that confuses a lot of people. That they'll say that Paul was no longer a Jew, and but he was a Jew till his dying day, his last breath. He was probably saying Shema Israel, and so because that's what Jews who are fixing to die would do back in those days. They would recite the Shema, and so anyway, that's what that was about. So let's go ahead and try to finish this out. It says, don't you know that in a stadium the runners all run? Let me get going here. Okay. Don't you know in the stadium the runners all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Every competitor exercises self-control in all respects. They do it to receive a perishable crown, but we do it to receive an imperishable one. So I run in this way, not aimlessly. So I box in this way, not just beating the air, but rather I punish my body and bring it into submission, so that I have preached to others. I myself will not be disqualified. There's a lot of good stuff. I mean, you could preach several sermons out of this right here about, he says, in the stadium, all runners run. In this area of Corinth, they had the Isthmian Games, which was like the Olympic Games, but in a different part. And it was a big deal all over the Greco-Roman world. This was a big deal. Competitors came from all over the place and they would run, but there's only one guy that would get the prize. And so Paul says, run in such a way that you may win. You run all out. Everything that you've got, you need to run to win. This idea of participation trophies is baloney. You try to run to win and do everything that you can. I've had, when I was in the music world, and we would be preparing for a service or something like that, and I was a dictator when it came to trying to get the music right, and so somebody said, well, it's good enough. We'll just pray the Holy Spirit will just make it right when we get out there. And because they were tired of practicing. And no, right there in front of God and everybody, we had a come to Jesus meeting about that sort of attitude. About, you have to do this to the very best abilities. Is everybody going to win that race that he's talking about? No, only one would do it. But in God's economy, in God's games here, if we're talking about sports and so forth, and that connotation, if we run the race to the very best of our ability, it's not a participation trophy that we get, but it's a crown that you've won because you've done the very best that you can do. You've done what I ask you to do. And so in that respect, in that regard, then we all can win the prize. And it's not a one that just goes away, but it's imperishable. It will never, ever go away. So Paul says, I am focused. When I'm competing, I run so that I can win no matter what. He says, so when I'm boxing, if I'm in the boxing ring, he says, I just don't go out there and throw my hands around. No, I'm making, I'm boxing so that I can defeat my opponent. I'm trying to get that right cross and that left hook and that uppercut and just get in there and beat the opponent. He says, I'm focused on that. And he says, I punish my body. I work out. I get it ready to go. And of course, again, he's talking of these in sports analogies. And he says, I do all of that so that after I have preached the gospel to others, then I myself don't be disqualified by failing the Lord and failing in some moral aspect or something like that. So anyway, that is what Paul is, what he talked about in that. So all of us who serve the Lord to the best of our abilities, and we push and we do what he asks us to do, we will win the crown. It's not a winner take all. It's for us, it's winners all if we follow the Lord and do what he tells us. And it's certainly not a participation trophy. You have to work for it to get the full benefits of what the Lord has for us. And there, the Bible talks about that. Some people we're going to get your offerings to the Lord are silver and gold. Some people are just wood, hay, and stubble that gets burned up. So when you get there, you have nothing, not a whole lot to offer. So strive for the silver and the gold and work hard at it. So that is the lesson for tonight. And we actually finished off the lesson without being bumped off, I think, out of the internet. So are there comments or questions that somebody wanted to come out with? Carmen.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, no problem. It's always a pleasure. Anybody else got a comment or question? If not, I'll say, Lila Tove, I'm gonna cut off the recording so that then the people can talk. So Lila Tove and Shavuot Tov, we'll see you next week.